Greetings fellow ukuleleans, Jeff Weinberger coming at you here with a new ukulele tutorial. Today I'd like to kick off a new series, and this one is going to be about the Latin influence in American pop music, specifically the early 60s, or more or less the late 50s into the early 60s. We had an awful lot of Latin influences in our music, the music that was on the charts at the time. We can be talking about the Drifters, Benny King. We could be talking about the Shangri-Las, so many groups that had hits back in those days, and they had either Latin percussion in them, Latin influenced rhythms, all kinds of Latin vocal phrasing. There's a lot of music that would not have been possible back then. Huge hits that would not have been possible without that Latin influence. So let's talk a little bit about music history and then get a bit into playing and see what this means for us as ukulele players. So the Brill Building, that's an important part of this whole history. The Brill Building was in Manhattan in New York City, and that is where a lot of music publishers were located at the time. After World War II, there was a huge industry. The music industry, the pop music industry was big. Um, People had a little extra money, there was a little disposable income, there was a little bit of leisure time. People were looking for something new. There was a new youth culture, like a teen culture. In the 50s, we didn't have that before. People lived on family farms, and they tended not to have teenagers live apart from and have a lot of activities away from the family. They were a little more tight-knit units. And then as soon as World War II ended and American prosperity was booming and people were buying cars and teenagers had cars and music and car culture and something to call their own, um, records started sounding like hotcakes. And you only need look back as far as the late 50s with Elvis, and then the early 60s with the Beatles, and on and on. It was a whole big industry for a while there, and music still is a large industry. It's just transformed so much over time. But back then, we also had another factor after World War II, and that was cheap airfare. It was a lot more accessible to the average person to buy a plane ticket and go somewhere that wasn't the United States, somewhere like Cuba or Mexico or Brazil, Argentina, etc. So people were into kind of exotica. They were into traveling to new lands and distant cultures and tropical places, and that was celebrated in our American culture here in the U.S. This thing called exotica, Hawaiian music, that was part of it, but that's a whole separate subject. We're talking about Latin music. So there are certain songs that really, for me, mark that era and mark what we're discussing today. And I'd like to talk about a couple of those songs today. I have a little list here. Let's check them out. Very first one, that I was just playing a little improvised chord melody version of Spanish Harlem. Not worked out. That was spontaneous, so forgive me if there was a mistake or two, or if it didn't sound exactly like the song. It was just kind of a fantasy based on Spanish Harlem. Well, that was the song that Benny King actually performed. We all know Benny King's version, but it was Jerry Lieber, who was one of those Brill Building composers, huge hits for Elvis and lots of others, and also Phil Spector. Everyone knows Phil Spector from the Ronettes and the Crystals and some of those big, huge hits he had, the Righteous Brothers, and then later on worked with some of the Beatles and whatnot. But Phil Spector also helped write that song. So this was 1960 we're talking about, Spanish Harlem. There was also Lonely Teardrops. That was a little earlier. That was 58. And that was Jackie Wilson. Great, great song. That kind of has this Latin rhythm to it that we'll be talking about. And that was written by Berry Gordy, co-written with Berry Gordy, and that was before Motown, Berry Gordy being the founder of Motown Records. But this was a little bit before that, way over in Detroit. And so, Under the Boardwalk, everyone knows that. That's from 1964. It was the Drifters, and that was written by a couple gentlemen named Resnick and Young, straight out of that Brill Building, Tin Pan Alley tradition in New York. Save the Last Dance for Me. That was 1960. The Drifters. The Drifters had a lot of hits, right, in those couple of years there. And that was written by Doc Pomus and Mort Schumann. And Doc Pomus went on to be famous for writing lots of songs that Buddy Holly did. Roy Orbison, Elvis, pretty famous songwriter. So last one is Save the Last Dance. The last one is Stand By Me. And that was a Benny King hit in 1961. And that was written by Benny King along with Lieber and Stoller. So there were certain songwriters that really tapped into this Latin influence and knew that it was the thing. Of course, Latin music was popular in the United States a little bit before World War II. There were some mambo clubs in Harlem and on the Lower East Side in New York, but it wasn't really until after World War II that Latin music became a mainstream thing. And Americans just loved dancing the mambo and the cha-cha-cha, and you had the mambo kings, the Latin mambo kings from New York, and all those great dance halls where mambo was played. And a lot of Cuban influence came into this. So the main thing musically that we're talking about isn't necessarily stereotypical Latin percussion. It's not like all this music necessarily had congas and had like guijeros in it and, you know, typical Latin instruments. Some of it did. Save the Last Dance for Me and Under the Boardwalk being very good examples of that. But sometimes it was just kind of the general influence. And that's going to affect us as ukulele players in how we strum these songs. And so if you were strumming something like Save the Last Dance for Me, for instance, you're not going to strum it with a rock and roll strum necessarily. You're not going to strum it with a folk strum or a country strum. You're going to want to get kind of a calypso strum going in that. And the calypso strum, which most of you know, or the island strum, we think of that as being Caribbean, and it truly is, but Caribbean and Latin are just interrelated. There's hardly any difference when you're talking about Latin music and Caribbean music, although there are some specific regional things. These are intertwined. It's just one big, huge diaspora of people. And of course, it goes back to Africa and Afro-Cuban music and Afro-Latin music and Afro-Caribbean music. So it's one big melting pot, and it made its way here. Quite possibly New Orleans was a place where a lot of this music met and cross-culturated and then went up the Mississippi River and made its way up. But rather than get too far into the history of it, let's get into the playing of it. So Save the Last Dance for Me. We have a very typical rhythm in that, something like this. You can dance, dun, 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 go and have your fun. Dun, 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 dun. So that song, Save the Last Dance for Me, yes, you could play that with just a straight calypso strum. And if well done and executed well and with a good feel and steadiness to it, that could work. That would not be that big of a compromise. And I know many of you out there in ukulele groups that play this song probably use something like that, the calypso strum. But let me propose something else. There's a way to get that Latin sound into the calypso strum, and that is simply by doing this on the very first beat. I've talked about this before. This is borrowed from Spanish flamenco guitar playing. It's called the Rasgueado. And Rasgueado or albañejo is the Spanish word for fan. So this is like a fan strum. And that's a good name for it, the fan strum. Let's call it that. What we're doing is fanning out our fingers like that. Our index finger hits, and then our middle finger hits, followed by our ring, and followed by our pinky, using our fingernails on the backs of our fingers to get that great sound, very reminiscent of Spanish flamenco guitar.